The horse moved slow beneath him, hooves sinking in the pale dust of the town's single street. Elias Harrow sat tall in the saddle, though his frame carried the wear of years and his face bore the mark of an old wound, a thin scar running from temple to jaw. He did not bow his head against the stairs, but neither did he return them. The grey evening settled heavy, clouds dragging shadows across rooftops, and every eye seemed to follow him as though he had brought the storm with him. He had come with no announcement, no flourish, only the weary gait of a man who wished to be left to his land. Yet rumour rode faster than any horse, and men muttered into their mugs as he passed the saloon. Once a soldier, they said, a man who had seen too much, done too much. Others called him half-ghost, carrying silence like a weapon. The children, wide-eyed and restless, trailed after until their mothers pulled them back by their collars. On the far end of the street sat a small house with a sagging porch. Clara Dunn stood there, her shawl drawn tight, hands folded against her chest. Widowhood had carved lines deep around her eyes, but those eyes were steady as she watched him. In Elias's posture, straight-backed yet somehow hollow, she saw a reflection of her own years of endurance, of loneliness that gnawed but did not consume. She did not wave. Neither did he. 2 silent acknowledgments passed between them before he rode on. By sundown, Elias had left the town behind. He stabled his horse, carried his few supplies into the weather-beaten ranch house he had claimed for himself, and set about the simple work of lighting a fire. The room smelled of dust and old wood, of tools long unused. He found some comfort in the stillness, though the weight of his solitude pressed sharp against his ribs. He drank coffee from a chipped tin cup, staring into the flames, until a sound outside drew him from his chair. At first it was faint, a cry carried on wind and river. Then it grew sharper, urgent, echoing from the direction of the swollen current that cut through the valley. Elias grabbed his lantern and rifle, though it was instinct rather than fear that put the weapon in his hand. The river was wild that night, its surface boiling with the rush of late rains. Against that chaos he saw movement, a figure thrashing, fighting the water's pull. He ran, boots sinking into mud. In the lantern's flicker, he saw her, a woman, towering even as the water dragged her under, her long braid thrashing like a black rope against the current. She rose for a moment, gasped, and was gone beneath the surge. Elias dropped his rifle on the bank, tore off his coat, and plunged into the freezing torrent. The cold bit deep, cutting breath from his lungs, but he forced his arms forward, fighting the water as though against an old enemy. His hands found her shoulder. She fought him at first, wild with fear and pride, but her strength was failing fast. With the stubborn will of a man who had lost too much already to rivers, Elias hauled her back, stroke by desperate stroke, until they both collapsed on the bank. She lay there gasping, dark eyes wide with defiance and terror, chest heaving beneath the soaked fabric of her dress. Her braid clung to her face, heavy as a serpent, and her hands clawed at the mud as though she might rise and flee even in her weakness. For a long moment, neither spoke. Elias pressed a hand to her back, steadying her breathing, murmuring words she may not have understood but that steadied him as much as her. The lantern cast its glow upon her face, revealing features proud and strong, carved with a dignity the river could not strip away. She was no stranger to battle, that much was plain. Behind them, faint voices carried on the wind. From the far bank, a cluster of settlers had gathered, torches flaring against the night. Their muttering rose, edged with suspicion. To them, Elias's act was no rescue but a betrayal, saving enemy blood when so many graves on this soil bore the scars of war. Their faces in the firelight were hard, whispering of trouble to come. Elias ignored them. He wrapped his coat around the woman's shoulders, lifting her with careful strength. She did not thank him, nor did he expect it. Her weight leaned into him for the briefest moment before she pushed away, standing unsteady but unbroken. Their eyes met, his scarred and weary, hers fierce despite exhaustion, and something unspoken passed between them. The murmurs grew louder. Elias turned his back on them, guiding her toward the shelter of his ranch. He knew what judgment awaited, the cold welcome of neighbors who would never understand. Yet as the river roared behind him, he realized there had been no choice to make. A life drowning was a life worth saving. And if that decision deepened his exile, so be it. He would carry it as he carried everything else, in silence, with the weight of a man who could not do otherwise. The barn smelled of damp straw and horsehide, the air heavy with the scent of rain still clinging to the earth. Elias laid a blanket across the hay, set a lantern on a beam, and eased the woman down upon it. Her breath came sharp, her skin cold as stone. He wrapped her in wool, movement steady, reverent, as though afraid she might vanish back into the river if he faltered. She did not resist, though her eyes, dark and fathomless, never left his face. She gave no name that night. Only silence, threaded with the faint tremor of exhaustion. Elias did not press her. He tended to her wounds as he had tended to his own countless times in the field, careful hands cleaning the raw scrapes, the river's bite still etched in her skin. His mind betrayed him, carrying him to another night, years past, when he had fought a river's pull with all his strength and still failed. His wife's face, pale and broken, surfaced in memory. He had dragged her from the current too late, her hand slipping from his as if fate itself had pried it away. He felt the weight of it now as he wrapped the stranger's hands, his jaw locked against the tide of guilt. By morning, she stirred with more strength. Her gaze carried storms, grief, pride, and a guarded flame that would not be snuffed. When he offered her a cup of water, she accepted it with both hands, a brief nod of respect but no words. Later, he heard the scrape of charcoal. She had taken a fragment from the firewood pile and was marking the barn wall, lines, curves, symbols foreign to him. Prayer, perhaps, or memory etched into wood, an act of holding on to what the river had nearly stolen. The sight unsettled him, yet also stilled him. She carried her pain outward, carving it into the world, while he buried his in silence until it festered. In town, whispers grew sharper. Elias rode in for supplies, his presence greeted with stiff shoulders and narrowed eyes. Men muttered near the saloon door, spitting into the dust, calling him reckless or worse. Some said the Apache woman was a lure, that more would come under cover of night. Others called him traitor outright. He ignored them, but the words clung like burrs. His solitude had been heavy before, now it was near suffocating. That evening, Clara Dunn came. She carried a small basket of bread and beans, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. She set it on his porch without ceremony, her eyes fixed on him with a quiet sternness. "You'll find no peace keeping her here," she warned, though her voice trembled more with concern than reproach. Elias thanked her with a nod, his words caught somewhere between gratitude and shame. When the lantern burned low, he caught her watching him, not with judgment, but with something unspoken, the recognition of another soul pressed thin by years of endurance. In her gaze, he saw his own reflection, lonely yet unyielding. Inside the barn, the woman, Naya, as he would soon learn, watched the flames lick the edge of the lantern glass. She had not asked to be saved, and yet here she was, tethered to the life of a man who barely spoke. Elias leaned against the wall, scar catching the lamplight, studying the marks she had made. He thought of the way Clara had folded her shawl close, of the way his wife's hand had slipped from his, of the way this woman etched her grief upon the boards as though daring the world to see it. Something shifted in him then. He began to sense that suffering was not his alone, nor loneliness a private wound. Clara bore it, Naya bore it, and countless others carried it beneath the same unyielding sky. Pain did not divide them, it was the thread binding one forsaken soul to another. Elias, for the first time in years, felt the faintest crack in the silence he had carried like armor. The first whisper of the storm came with a restless wind that rattled loose boards and moaned through the cracks of Elias's weathered home. By dusk the sky had lowered into a black wall, streaked with veins of lightning that split the prairie horizon. The air grew sharp, metallic, heavy with the scent of rain yet to fall. Elias shuttered the windows, tied down what he could, and led the horses into the barn where Naya sat in silence, her braid hanging damp down her back. She had been restless all day, pacing the packed earth floor with a tension that gnawed at her composure. When the first drops struck the roof like thrown stones, she stood abruptly, her eyes flashing with determination. She pointed toward the river, shaking her head when Elias blocked the doorway. She pressed her hands to her chest, then gestured outward, as if to say something of herself still lay beyond the storm. Elias argued in his way, few words, a hard shake of his head, but she did not relent. The wind tore the door open with a cry, and she stepped into the torrent. With a growl of frustration, Elias followed, pulling his coat tight, boots sinking into the mud that already sucked at the earth. Rain lashed their faces, and thunder cracked above as if the heavens themselves were breaking apart. By the river, swollen and wild again, Naya fell to her knees, hands clawing through the mud near the bank. Lightning lit her face, fierce, desperate, unbending. Elias, teeth gritted against the downpour, dropped beside her. His hands, rough and scarred, pressed into the earth until he felt something solid beneath the sludge. Together they wrenched it free, a small carved figure, worn smooth by years, shaped with reverence and skill. She clutched it to her chest, eyes closing as if she had recovered a soul rather than wood. The storm had stripped her strength, though. She swayed, drenched and trembling, her towering frame shivering like a child's. Elias slipped his old soldier's coat from his shoulders and set it across hers. The fabric sagged with water, but the gesture held warmth beyond the cloth. She looked at him then, truly looked, her fierce gaze softened by gratitude unspoken. For the first time, she seemed less a symbol of otherness and more a reflection, another human being holding fiercely to memory, to survival, to dignity. They fought their way back through the storm, the figure pressed against her chest, his steady hand at her arm. When they reached the porch, another figure stood waiting, lantern glowing against the dark curtain of rain. Clara Dunn, shawl plastered to her shoulders, had braved the weather to see if Elias still stood. Her eyes widened at the sight of the two together, wounded, soaked, bound by some wordless pact forged in the storm. Without question, Clara stepped inside with them, setting the lantern down by the hearth. The three of them gathered near the fire as Elias coaxed flames from stubborn wood. Water dripped from coats and shawls, hissing when it met the embers. Outside, the rain roared against the roof, a ceaseless drumming that made the walls shudder. Inside, silence hung heavy, broken only by the crackle of kindling and the thunder rolling overhead. Naya sat nearest the fire, cradling the carved figure like a child. Clara watched her with wary eyes, but not unkind. Elias leaned back in his chair, scarred face lit in gold and shadow, studying both women with the same quiet intensity he gave the fire. The storm raged without mercy, but within those walls lay a fragile refuge, bound together not by trust, not yet, but by the sheer force of survival. The hours stretched long. Clara mended her shawl in the firelight, each stitch deliberate, as though sewing her own nerves back together. Naya turned the figure slowly in her hands, tracing its grooves, whispering sounds Elias did not know. He did not need to understand. The ritual itself spoke of love and loss. Elias sat with his rifle across his knees, the storm's fury outside mirrored by the weight in his chest. He had lived long enough to know that storms stripped men and women bare, left them raw and honest, no matter what armor they tried to wear. And in that rawness, he saw something he had not dared to look for. Naya's grief was not foreign, it was his own in another tongue. The storm had given him no choice but to see it, to admit it. She was not an enemy, not other, but a mirror held up against his silence, showing him survival in another shape. The storm did not pass quickly. Days stretched long beneath its grey shroud, the sky pouring itself over the earth as if to drown the very memory of sunlight. The ranch became an island in a sea of mud, its walls the thin barrier against the unending roar of wind and rain. Within those walls, silence was no longer balm but a taut string, drawn tight between three souls who bore their solitude in different ways. Clara Dunn kept to the kitchen table, sewing needle glinting in the lantern light. She mended the same shawl she had brought that first night, her hands pulling thread through fabric with sharp precision. It was not the shawl that demanded her work, but the act of stitching itself, holding together what could so easily unravel. Her eyes often lifted to Naya, and though they were not cruel, they carried a weight of caution, as though uncertain where this new presence would settle in the fragile balance of her world. Naya remained watchful, her tall frame both commanding and weary. She kept close to the fire, drying her braid before reworking it strand by strand. Each twist of hair seemed deliberate, a ritual of endurance, proof that even in exile she would not allow herself to be undone. Her gaze met Clara's more than once, steady and unreadable, and though no words passed, mistrust hung between them like smoke. Elias moved between them, though he chose few words and fewer glances. He kept his hands busy, splitting kindling, checking shutters, and when night fell, polishing the rifle that rested across his lap. The metal gleamed under lamplight, a symbol of both shelter and threat. His fingers knew the motions by heart, and with each stroke of the rag, memories rose unbidden. The sharp smell of powder, the cries of men in the dust, the endless years of choosing sides in battles that left only graves. He had once sworn to turn from it, yet here he was again, guarding two women who did not trust one another, each one testing his silence. The house held its breath with them. Meals passed in sparse exchanges, the sound of rain filling every pause. At times Elias caught Clara's eyes softening when they lingered on him, her mouth parting as if to speak, only to close again. At other times, Naya's glance rested on him with something fiercer, a challenge, perhaps, or a measure of his strength. Both women looked to him for something, though neither named it, and Elias, with his scarred face and scarred past, wondered if he had anything left to give. On the third evening, the storm broke just long enough for the sound of hooves to cut through the silence. Elias rose, rifle in hand, as voices approached outside. He opened the door to a clutch of townsmen, their hats dripping, their eyes hard with suspicion. One stepped forward, hand resting near his belt. "You're harboring her," the man said, voice raised above the wind. "That Apache woman. You'll hand her over. She brings trouble, and trouble we won't suffer on our soil." Elias stood in the doorway, the lantern behind him casting his figure into a shadow across the rain-slicked porch. He said nothing at first, only held the rifle close enough that its polished barrel caught the light. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of iron. "She stays." The words cut sharper than any shout. The men shifted uneasily, spitting into the mud, muttering. One cursed under his breath, but none advanced. They saw in Elias not a plea, but a wall. They saw the scar on his face, the stillness in his eyes, the mark of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate again if pressed. When at last they turned and rode away, their torches vanishing into the sheets of rain, Elias closed the door with slow finality. Inside, the silence swelled again, but it was not the same. Clara's hands had gone still upon her shawl, her eyes wide with something like awe. She had known him as a man of quiet sorrow, but not as a man willing to stand against an entire town for what was right. Her heart trembled, shaken by the steel beneath his solitude. Naya, watching from the hearth, drew her braid over her shoulder and held it firm. For the first time, her face softened, the mistrust giving way to recognition. She understood defiance when she saw it, understood what it meant for a man to risk exile for her life. Trust did not blossom easily, but the seed had been planted in that moment of quiet refusal. Elias returned to his chair, set the rifle across his knees once more, and let out a long breath he had not known he held. The storm rattled the shutters, the lantern flickered, and 3 lives sat together in uneasy silence, no longer strangers, not yet kin, but bound by the choice he had made. The storm broke not with thunder, but with a silence so wide it seemed the land itself held its breath. For the first time in days, sunlight pierced the grey, glinting off wet grass and dripping branches. The air smelled of damp earth and pine smoke, sharp and clean after the long suffocation of rain. Elias stepped out onto the porch, shoulders heavy but heart strangely lighter, and looked across the ranch that had barely held together against the gale. Fences had collapsed, shingles lay scattered like cards, and the barn door hung loose on its hinges. Yet the walls still stood. The land still waited. Life still pressed forward. He and Naya worked side by side as morning stretched into day. She carried beams as though they weighed nothing, her tall frame bent against the wind's ruin, while he hammered boards back into place, his scarred hand steady despite the ache in his bones. They moved without much talk, only the rhythm of labor tying them together, the lift, the strike, the breath. At times Elias caught himself watching her, seeing not just the power in her arms but the patience in her stance, the way she measured each motion with care as though honoring the ground beneath her. Clara lingered on the edges. She held nails in a small tin, fetched cloth to bind a blister on Elias's palm, and yet her eyes betrayed a weight heavier than any storm could bring. She watched the two of them, not with malice, but with a quiet sorrow that seemed to hollow her from within. There was a moment when Elias handed Naya a beam, their fingers brushing, and he felt Clara's gaze fall away like a shutter closing. That night, the 3 of them gathered by the fire. The storm had left the air sharp with chill, and the flames drew them closer in spite of the unspoken distance that still lingered. Sparks leapt toward the rafters, shadows dancing across the walls. Naya reached into her satchel, the one she had kept close even when unconscious, and pulled forth the small carved figure they had wrested from the mud days before. It was smoothed by time, the wood darkened by water, but its shape still held, a guardian with arms outstretched, face lifted toward the sky. She pressed it into Elias's palm. "Strength is not held alone," she said, voice low but steady. Her words were rough in his tongue, yet their meaning struck him deeper than the wind ever could. Elias stared at the figure, feeling the grain beneath his thumb. It was heavier than it looked, as though carrying not just wood but memory, ancestors, and all the griefs and hopes of a people who had lost and endured. He cleared his throat, the fire's warmth failing to ease the cold that rose from within. "My wife," the words caught, dusted with years of silence. He looked past the flames, past the 2 women, and saw the river again, the swirl of water, the hand he could not hold. Her last words, before the current took her, "She told me to keep the light. Even in dark country." The fire popped, sending sparks across the stone. Elias closed his hand around the carved figure, the weight of it merging with the weight of his memory. It did not feel like burden, not tonight. It felt like answer. Across the fire, Clara's breath shuddered. Tears brimmed in her eyes, catching the light before slipping down her cheeks. But they were not bitter tears. She did not weep for what she had lost, or for what might never belong to her. She wept because she saw something she had thought the world no longer held, the possibility of souls carrying one another even across the lines that divided them. She turned her face slightly, as if ashamed of her own weakness, and yet a small smile softened her lips. Survival, she realized, did not always mean being chosen. Sometimes it meant being witness, holding space for others, and knowing that even unreturned affection could carve a place in the heart that was still worth keeping. Elias said nothing more. Naya leaned back, her eyes reflecting firelight, her expression unreadable yet calm, as though the ritual of offering had eased some hidden weight. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, eyes glistening but steady now. The three of them formed a fragile circle around the hearth, broken people, bound by fire, storm, and silence. The night stretched long, but for the first time in years Elias did not feel entirely alone. He could sense the ember of something, not joy, not yet, but trust, gratitude, and a strange tenderness that threaded through the ruin of their lives. It flickered in Naya's gaze when she met his eyes, in the softened tremor of Clara's smile. The fire crackled, and he thought of his wife's words again. Keep the light. Even here, in this dark country, the flame had endured. The sun broke over the horizon like a blade, cutting through the thinning mist that clung to the plains. Elias stood in the yard, the dew soaking his boots, his hands resting heavy on the worn railing. He had not slept. The night had been too full of firelight and memory, too full of questions that no prayer could answer. And yet the dawn did not wait for men to be ready. It came, relentless, as it always had. Hoofbeats carried on the wind before the riders came into view. Elias knew by the rhythm of them that these were not townsfolk. They moved with the precision of warriors, steady and certain. The townspeople, already whispering at the edge of the fields, drew back, their faces pale beneath the rising sun. Naya's father rode at the front, a tall figure, his face carved with lines of both age and command, his eyes dark and sharp as obsidian. Warriors flanked him, their presence a shadow over the morning's fragile light. Naya stepped out from the barn where she had spent her last night in Elias's shelter. She was clothed in garments she had hidden away, her hair freshly braided, her posture tall despite the weakness that still lingered in her body. Elias saw her transform before his eyes, from the broken figure he had dragged from the river into the daughter of a people whose dignity no storm could wash away. The elder dismounted. The leather of his reins creaked as he let them fall, his boots sinking into the soft soil. He regarded Elias with a silence that felt heavier than a shout, his gaze sweeping over the scarred man who had pulled his child from death's grip. For a moment the entire plain seemed to wait, wind still, breath caught. Then the elder reached behind his saddle and lifted something wrapped in cloth. It was a rifle, old but ornate, its stock inlaid with silver and carved with symbols Elias could not name but could feel. They spoke of heritage, of battles endured, of stories carried in the grain of wood and the weight of steel. The elder held it out. Elias hesitated, his scarred hands trembling, before accepting it. The weapon felt alive, not as a tool of killing, but as a vessel of honor, of recognition across a chasm that had swallowed so many before them. You returned life to me, the elder said, his words rough but clear. So I return to you trust. The settlers watching from a distance shifted uneasily, their mouths dry, their suspicions silenced. They had expected war, blood in the dirt, perhaps the fire of revenge. Instead, they witnessed something far rarer, respect rendered not in fear, but in gratitude. Clara stood just beyond the porch, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her face was pale but steady, her eyes shining with something Elias had never seen there before, not longing, not envy, but dignity. She turned to him once, offering the smallest nod, as if to say she understood at last her place in the world's wide web of sorrow and grace. When she walked back toward town, her steps were slow but certain, carrying not defeat but quiet pride. Naya lingered as her father prepared to mount again. She stepped toward Elias, her gaze holding his with a force that words could never equal. Her hand, warm and strong, clasped his scarred one. No speech passed between them, only the truth that both carried now, remembrance. The promise that though their paths diverged, they had shared something that no time or distance could erase. When she turned and mounted her horse, joining her father's side, Elias felt both the hollow of departure and the fullness of gratitude swell inside him. He watched until the riders became silhouettes against the horizon, swallowed by the shimmer of heat rising off the plains. The townsfolk drifted away, their whispers subdued, their certainties unsettled. Elias remained where he stood, the rifle heavy in his hands, the morning wind tugging dust across the earth. He was alone again, as he had been when he first rode into this wary town. But it was not the same aloneness. His silence no longer weighed as shame, but as witness. His loneliness no longer rang hollow, but as proof that even in dark country, light could be kept, pass like flame from one soul to another. He lifted his gaze to the horizon where Naya had vanished, then to the sky washed in pale gold. His scar itched in the sun's warmth, but for once it felt less like a wound and more like a mark of having endured. The wind carried the faint smell of pine and damp earth, remnants of the storm, reminders of what had been weathered. Elias set the rifle gently inside the house, a gift not just of wood and steel, but of meaning. Then he stepped out onto the porch again, breathing deep. The plain stretched before him, harsh, untamed, unforgiving. Yet for the first time in many years, Elias felt the stirrings of something within him. Not peace, perhaps, but strength. Not joy, but honor. He would live. He would remember. And that was enough.